Ladies and gentlemen, this is TVP World. I'm your host Benjamin Lee, and welcome aboard the Eastern Express. Now, in this episode, we're looking into a potentially major geopolitical shift happening in the South Caucasus, Armenia's reorientation of its foreign policy. For years, Yerevan has been in a tight, a bit one-sided embrace with Russia, relying heavily on its northern neighbor for military, economic, and political support. However, recent events and frustrations have sparked a dramatic reconsideration of these ties, with Armenia looking increasingly towards the West. What might be the difficulties of decoupling from Russia? And who might help Yerevan out in this time of need? Now, we'll try to answer these questions, but first, let's take a look at our latest report to find out more.
Russia has once again issued stern warnings to Armenia over its continued westward drift. Responding to Yerevan's participation in the recent NATO summit, Russian Deputy Foreign Minister expressed concern about Armenia's security being put at greater risk.
By deepening cooperation at such a pace with those whose goal is the strategic defeat of Russia, Yerevan risks serious destabilization of the situation in the South Caucasus, including to the detriment of its own security.
This statement comes amidst Armenia's growing rift with its long-standing ally Russia and its increasing military cooperation with the United States. As part of this shift, Yerevan has started yet another round of joint military exercises with the United States. The exercises, named Eagle Partner 2024, involve soldiers from the Special Peacekeeping Brigade, the US Army in Europe and Africa, and the Kansas National Guard. The aim is to enhance interoperability by practicing stabilization actions during a joint peace operation in a simulated conflict zone. These developments have not gone unnoticed by the Kremlin, which has historically considered the South Caucasus region within its sphere of influence. Moscow emphasizes that the Russia-led Security Treaty Organization is the only real mechanism of ensuring Armenia's security. The collective, Armenia said it would leave.
And now, let's take a look at the issue in greater detail. Armenia's disillusionment with Russia began intensifying in 2020, when during the Second Nagorno-Karabakh War, neither Russia nor the Collective Security Treaty Organization stepped in to assist Armenia against Azerbaijan. Despite the supposed strategic alliance, Russia's hands-off approach continued through subsequent border skirmishes and Azerbaijan's incursions into what Armenia considers its sovereign territory. By 2022, the sentiment in Armenia had shifted significantly. Trust in Russia plummeted from 87% in 2019 to just 31% in 2023. After Azeri blockade and later military incursion into Nagorno-Karabakh, Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan, who has long hinted at a westward pivot, finally took decisive steps. He suspended Armenia's participation in the CSTO, announced a review of strategic relations with Russia, and indicated a desire to strengthen ties with the European Union. These actions were not without risk. Pashinyan's declarations have been cautious, reflecting a fear of potential Russian retaliation, which could range from economic sanctions to direct political interference. Armenia's economic entanglement with Russia is deep, way deep. Russia supplies nearly all of Armenia's gas controls key sectors like transportation, telecommunications, and remains the largest trading partner. Now, this economic leverage gives Moscow significant influence over Yerevan, but Armenia is gradually trying to loosen these ties. It has limited its participation in CSTO activities, demanded withdrawal of Russian border guards from key points, and sought new military partnerships, including arms deals with India and France. So what's driving Armenia towards the EU and the West? Part of it is a simple desire for survival and sovereignty. Armenia wants to avoid being a pawn in Russia's geopolitical games. The European Union, recognizing this strategic shift, has stepped in with support. Now, Yerevan is also courting the United States. In recent months, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken visited Yerevan, promising $65 million in aid, and discussions are underway about American investment in Armenia's energy sector. The potential for new nuclear power projects and other infrastructure investments are on the table, showcasing Armenia's efforts to diversify its international partnerships. Now, despite these moves, Armenia's foreign policy reorientation is fraught with challenges. Russia has not taken kindly to losing influence in what it considers its backyard. any significant realignment away from Moscow could provoke severe repercussions, including economic embargoes or attempts to destabilize the Armenian government. This precarious balance makes Armenia's western pivot a delicate operation, requiring careful maneuvering to avoid outright conflict with Russia. And now to shed more light on the issue is Rusy Posinov, director of the Topchova Center. Hello, sir, and welcome to Eastern Express.
Hello, thanks for having me.
So we are once again looking at Armenia's turn towards the west and away from Russia. Recently, we've seen the Armenian foreign minister present in the NATO summit in Washington. For a country that's traditionally seen under the Russian sphere of influence, that has to be a very big deal, right? Does that signify an acceleration towards Armenia going to the west?
It is one of the most discussed topics in our region, the so-called Armenia's pivot or geopolitical pivot to the west. On the one hand, a lot of enthusiasts, both in Armenia and abroad, especially in Western countries, who speculate about Armenia's breaking free from Russian dominance and going westward. However, there are also people who skeptically treat this issue because Armenia is institutionally attached to Russia in terms of economy, in terms of military, politically, because since its independence in the 1990s, Armenia has not only been a member state of different Moscow-led Eurasian structures, but also through a bilateral pact, a Russia ally.
Right, like you mentioned, there's probably two lines of public perception. Those who are more enthusiastic, most are more skeptical because of the traditional ties with Russia. What's your observation on the ground when it comes to the more popular public sentiment inside of the country? Do you see more people on the side of kind of this enthusiasm, or we have more skeptics?
Well, I do follow the Armenian media. I also have a chance to communicate with different Armenia-based experts. Those who assess Armenia's pivot to the West, as well as Armenia's relationship with Russia, most of them have some sort of optimism, but cautious optimism, because they understand Armenia's limitations. Because you can go westward until some point, but then you have to take into account different geopolitical realities. Geography is a destiny after all, because you live closer to Russia. You are part of the post-Soviet space, and you are not surrounded by the EU member states, which would facilitate, or NATO member states, which would facilitate this pivot. Armenia's only NATO neighbor is Turkey, with which Armenia has, softly speaking, not so good relations.
All right, there's no geopolitical reality where we can just transplant one piece of land to the west. So like you said, a lot of balancing and cautious optimism do need to be involved as they still have to deal with their neighbors. With that being said, you were talking about the institutionally tied nature of Armenia and Russia. So if this pivot is to indeed happen, what are some of the things that need to be decoupled? And what are some of the things that Armenia can perhaps rely on the Western world to provide in order to distance themselves?
First of all, Armenia hosts a Russian military base in Gyumri, a Russian 102nd military base. The Russians also operate several training grounds, a military air base. The Russian servicemen patrol the Armenia-Turkey and the Armenia-Iran borders. Nowadays, the Armenian authorities are trying to remove the Russian military from the Yerevan International Airport, and let's see how successful they will be. Even if this removal happens, the Russian military base is to stay in Armenia at least until 2044, according to the bilateral agreement. So the Western countries have to take these factors into account. Also, Armenia's dependence on Russia in terms of energy and economy. If I'm not mistaken, and I've heard this claim several times in the past several months, that the cheapest gas in the world is being sold to Armenia by Russia. So whoever wants to decouple Armenia from Russia must also provide an alternative for Armenia in terms of cheap gas or cheap energy resources. Also, the Armenians operate a nuclear power plant, and guess where the raw material, uranium, comes from? Of course, Russia. So in order to detach or decouple Russia from Armenia, you have to answer to a long list of questions.
Right, so it does sound like people who are more skeptical actually does have a lot of very valid points behind why they feel like this cannot be at a pace where maybe some people do want to see. And there's also the context of history, right? Russia and Armenia historically goes way back. Do you think that also kind of has cemented its presence in people's mind that maybe traditionally Armenia and Russia should be aligned?
Well, if we go back to history, the present Armenia has been part of Russia for at least 200 years, since the early 19th century. First, it was part of the Tsarist Russia. Then, in the 20th century, after a brief independence, it was then taken over by the Bolshevik or Soviet Union. So Armenia has been part of the Russian space or Russian domination for at least 2 centuries. And since, as I already said, since Armenia's independence in the 1990s, the country's attachment to Russia or to the Russian-led Eurasian structures has been institutionalized to that level that it would be very difficult to break or divorce from these now.
Right, so with so many things kind of going against the pivot to the West, it does seem like Armenia is still pursuing that with great enthusiasm. So can you help us understand what are the incentives and what is so great about the West that Armenia says, well, we will have to try to overcome all these hurdles and obstacles just in order to be closer to it?
The Armenian-Russian relations plus the Armenian public opinion on Russia have worsened, especially since 2020, when the country became defeated in a war against Azerbaijan and lost Karabakh, which is universally recognized as part of Azerbaijan, but had been controlled by Armenia for almost 3 decades. And since 2020, and especially since 2023, when Azerbaijan established full control over Karabakh, Armenia has been quite reluctant to accept Russia as an ally. And if you check, you can easily Google this on the internet. If you check the evolution of the Armenian public opinion on Russia, it's getting more and more negative nowadays, and only 20 or 30% in Armenia consider Russia as a friendly country. I'm not even using the term ally, and the majority of the population nowadays sees Russia even as a security threat.
All right, and do you see the recent I wouldn't say leak, but the information about Belarus supporting Azerbaijan with weapons, which of course can be linked back to Russia, would serve as a nail in the coffin to further drive Armenia to kind of pivot away from Russia?
Well, it is one of the factors, but not the major factor. Because Belarus, the Armenians knew that Belarus had been providing weapons to Azerbaijan even before the war, the 2020 war. The Armenians also knew that their former allies inside the CSTO, Kazakhstan, for instance, also was more supportive of Azerbaijan and Azerbaijan's Karabakh cause. So this is not something new. However, the Belarus case was recently utilized a lot by the Armenian politicians in order to justify their decoupling from Russia and pivot to the West. But as I said, this process is going to be very difficult, and at this moment it looks quite impossible.
Right. Well, we do see U.S. Conducting trainings within Armenia. Do you think that's a sign of goodwill from the West, from the United States, that they are welcoming this pivot? And how reliable do you think the United States can be as a partner to depend on for security?
That's a very good question. I guess we have to ask Western politicians, especially the United States and Europe-based politicians who are quite eager to help Armenia. Yes, we nowadays see these joint military drills, which involve both American and Armenian military men. We also notice, monitor how France is providing military aid to Armenia. This is, on the one hand, showing how the West is reacting to Armenia's signals, but at this moment, no Western actor, including the United States or the EU or France, is ready to replace Russia as a security guarantee or as a security patron for Armenia. But this is what many people, the majority of the population, is expecting. They are, the Armenian politicians, political circles, and the most of the ordinary citizens. This is what they are expecting, substituting Russia with a Western actor as a security patron.
Right, so we do have to keep our eyes peeled and see how that develops. In the meantime, thank you so much for your input and insight and helping us dissect this situation we're looking at. Really appreciate it. Thanks again for being with us on TV World.
My pleasure.
And now we're moving on to the Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you don't want to miss. Spanish law enforcement agencies have apprehended 3 pro-Russian individuals accused of launching cyberattacks against multiple NATO countries, including Poland and Spain. The arrests were made as part of a coordinated effort to combat the increasing threat of state-sponsored cyber activities.
The Spanish civil guard said the suspects were detained in connection with their alleged involvement in cyber attacks on public institutions and strategic sectors. Hackers targeted countries that provide military assistance to Ukraine as it fights against the Russian invasion. The suspects, whose identities have not been disclosed, are believed to be part of a larger network that has been targeting infrastructure and spreading disinformation. The operations they conducted were supposedly sophisticated and aimed at destabilizing the online presence of several Eastern European nations. They are currently being held in custody, awaiting further legal proceedings. Poland, one of the affected countries, has faced a series of cyber attacks in recent months. The Polish government has expressed its gratitude to the Spanish authorities for their swift action and international cooperation.
The Kremlin has taken further steps to tighten its grip on the flow of information within Russia, particularly on social networks. The American think tank, Institute for the Study of War, has reported an intensification of the Russian government's effort to control public discourse, especially concerning the ongoing conflict in Ukraine.
The Kremlin has reportedly intensified its censorship efforts on Russian social networks. The Institute for the Study of War suggests that these actions are part of a broader campaign to stifle dissent and maintain a pro-Kremlin stance among citizens. The ISW's findings indicate that the Kremlin is likely revising the process of labeling individuals as terrorists or extremists, a tactic that could lead to heightened self-censorship among Russian citizens. The move comes amid a backdrop of sustained propaganda efforts aimed at bolstering domestic support for the war in Ukraine. Despite this, independent surveys show a growing number of Russians favoring peace talks, a sentiment that clashes with the official state position. The majority of responders, however, blamed the US and NATO for the conflict and its casualties, indicating the effectiveness of the Kremlin's information operations.
Georgian authorities have summoned for questioning several volunteers who fought for Ukraine against Russian forces. The individuals were reportedly summoned on charges of plotting a coup and terrorism.
The State Security Service of Georgia has called in for interrogation at least 3 volunteers who had fought in Ukraine as part of the Georgian Legion, reportedly on charges related to plotting a coup and terrorism. Critics argue that this development undermines the spirit of international solidarity and could discourage others from providing much-needed support to Ukraine. The Georgian government's actions have been met with protests and calls for a fair and transparent legal process. Recent polls showed most Georgian citizens consider Russia to be their country's main enemy, with this sentiment growing compared to previous years. The ruling Georgian Dream Party, however, has been gradually moving closer to Moscow, reportedly planning to restore diplomatic relations and adapting Russian rhetoric regarding the war in Ukraine and the West.
France has denied visas to about 100 journalists, therapists, and technical workers seeking to attend the 2024 Summer Olympics in Paris. Among those denied visas on these grounds are Russian and Belarusian citizens.
The decision announced by the French Interior Minister to reject almost 100 visa requests before upcoming Olympics comes amidst heightened concerns over potential espionage activities in the country. The individuals affected by the visa denial include citizens of Russia and Belarus, 2 nations that have been under intense scrutiny following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, a military action that Minsk has supported. The French government's stance reflects a broad trend of wariness towards these countries, which have also been barred from participating in the Summer Olympics as a form of punishment for their role in the conflict in Ukraine. As Paris prepares for the upcoming Olympic Games, the International Olympic Committee has expressed concerns about the inevitable wave of Russian disinformation campaigns. Recent incidents, which have been attributed to Russian sources, have prompted the IOC to brace for a barrage of sophisticated misinformation targeting the Paris Olympics.
And that's all on this episode of Eastern Express. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.